Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. The outside world is getting crazier every single day, and everyone who's honest enough to admit that to himself knows that to be the case. You hop onto the news and you read things like, I don't know, a principal up in Vermont is suspended for her job because she was not enthusiastic enough about Black Lives Matter in a personal Facebook post that she put on her own Facebook page. Or you read about how Melanie Rolfe, the stepmother of former Atlanta police officer Garrett Rolfe, was fired from her job after she posted some things on her social media accounts, after which her coworkers said that they were no longer comfortable working with her. Or you read about how Democrats in Orange County, California, have the tomahawk out for John Wayne. Sane people are wondering how we can re-inject some sanity into the world before the mob comes after them, their family, their business, and before their city council decides that their town of Washington, named after Booker T. Washington, needs to be renamed because the name is now racist. One solution being offered is classical liberalism, with one of its chief and most prominent disciples being Dave Rubin, host of the YouTube talk show The Rubin Report. Rubin, who just published a book which is part autobiography and part political manifesto, says that classical liberalism is the last best hope that free people have of creating a free society. And the best part is that this political philosophy is so simple, it can be explained in under 2 minutes. I won't play his whole 2-minute description, link to the whole thing is in the description box, but here is the important part.
Classical liberalism is the idea that individual freedom and limited government are the best way for humans to form a free society. The core belief that the individual should always be considered above the group always remain constant. Putting the individual above the group not only empowers you to live your life as you see fit, but it also neutralizes the forces of racism and bigotry. What matters is whether you wish to live as a free person in a free society based on your own ideas and actions.
Because of its emphasis on individual rights, equality before the law, and the quote-unquote light touch of government, classical liberalism especially emphasizes things like free speech, so that ideas and opinions can be discussed in the public square, and it also maintains that that public square must remain secular, separation of church and state, so that no one idea or group of ideas can be pushed onto a person or group of people unwillingly. Something that you might think is especially relevant today when we remember that groups like Black Lives Matter and Antifa are physical manifestations of intersectionality, which itself is a quasi-religion. And the best part, they say, is that classical liberalism is completely in line with the founding of the United States. As Rubin says,
the classical liberal tradition was born from great thinkers such as John Locke, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Thomas Jefferson. While they all tinkered in their own way with the ideas of classical liberalism, the core belief that the individual should always be considered above the group always remained constant. Thomas Jefferson even threw in the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence to drive home the point that your happiness wasn't the government's to give, but rather yours to take.
There's even an entire school of American historiography that agrees with this. The political philosophy of liberalism, to distinguish it from the political movement of liberalism, is often seen as a complete break with the past, the triumph of the European Enlightenment over the ideas of the ancient world and the Renaissance. And many historians would argue that in being the first modern nation, the United States was the first liberal nation, the first nation to really break with the ideas of the past. The 20th century prominent American historian Henry Steele Commager entitled his Pièce de Résistance, after all, The Empire of Reason, how Europe imagined and America realized the Enlightenment. Louis Hardy also wrote a book called The Liberal Tradition in America. Not a bad explanation, but it doesn't explain enough. Classical liberals like to present their philosophy as being very straightforward. All we have to do is hold these few simple principles and shazam! Everything will turn out okay. We will live in a free and just society. The problem is, classical liberalism doesn't guarantee that because classical liberalism doesn't have a solid foundation. For example, one of Rubin's classical liberal principles is absolute equality under the law for everyone. But why should everyone be equal under the law? In an interview in The American Mind, Rubin mentions God-given rights And he also says how Jordan Peterson has influenced him into accepting that there are empirical truths outside of us. So you might think, okay, maybe this is where we get our defense of equality. But then he says that once we have that morality outside of ourselves, quote, we can pick and choose how to behave in that moral code. That leads to an immediate problem. If we choose a morality, if we actually take on a moral code, then we can't just pick and choose what to follow in that moral code. Moral codes aren't buffet lines. And unless you're an ideologue or maybe a pirate of the Caribbean, they're more than just guidelines. You can't just turn them on or turn them off whenever it's convenient for you. Here's a second problem. If you can choose your code of morality, but then you choose what you follow and what you don't follow within that code of morality, you really don't have an objective foundational reason to do anything. You just have a utilitarian argument that says, hey, this is how we should act because everything will run much more smoothly that way. And things running more smoothly isn't a good foundational reason to do anything. Now, to be fair, in that same interview, Rubin also hitched equality with reason, saying that since we're all reasonable creatures, we should all be treated equally. And you're thinking at first, okay, great, maybe this is where we're going to get our explanation. But then comes the follow-up question that is never answered. What is reason? Is reason a metaphysical element that everyone possesses by virtue of their having a human nature? Or is it just the ability to do things like multiply large sums in our head or learn different languages? And if it's the latter, and if some people don't have those abilities, does that mean that those people don't have to be treated equally? American founding and its experiment in ordered liberty worked for as long as it did, because it did more than just say, yeah, everyone has natural rights, everyone should be treated equally under the law, and we should have less government. The founders and the revolutionaries drew deeply from several different wells, traditions, we might even say, if we can still use that horrible word, in order to make their experiment work. The first well was religion. Now today, it's very fashionable to brush-stroke the founders as either all deists or all evangelical Christians, depending on which side of the scales you fall on. But as usual, the truth is a bit more complicated than that. Now, there were some founders who were definitely unorthodox. Jefferson, Franklin, even my man John Adams picked up and held some heterodoxical beliefs later on in his life. And historians are still arguing, as they usually do, over whether he was a rational theist, a Unitarian, or just a liberal Christian. But there were also other founders like Roger Sherman, John Witherspoon, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Benjamin Rush, even George Washington, who were Orthodox Christians. What can also be said is that regardless of their personal beliefs, all of the founders saw themselves as being Christian. Furthermore, practically the entire colonial population of the 18th century, almost all 3 million of them, were Christian. Different denominations to be sure, but they all traced themselves back to Abraham and all professed a belief in Christ. And when they talked about religion, true religion as they put it, they were talking about Christianity. For example, in 1833, Jasper Adams preached a sermon entitled The Relation of Christianity to Civil Government in the United States. But before delivering it to his congregation, he sent copies of it to various leaders and asked for their comments and thoughts. Former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, nominated to the bench by John Adams, said in his comments, quote, Christianity and religion are identified, unquote, in the United States, meaning that in the practical and regular parlance of the day, when someone talked about religion, they were talking about Christianity. Or take another earlier example. In his circular to the states, sent out in 1783, George Washington mentioned, quote-unquote, the divine author of our blessed religion, obviously a poetical way of naming Christianity. A Christianity that was so prominent that he could send the same message to all 13 different states. And Christianity wasn't just the private religion of the masses of the 18th century. It was seen as a vital component that was necessary for the success of Republican government. John Adams, right before independence was declared, wrote, quote, religion and morality alone can secure the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. Reverend Eliezer Goodrich preached, quote, religion and virtue are the strongest bonds of human society. And this wasn't just some New England Puritan-infused belief either. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, that would be in Maryland, said, quote, without morals, a republic cannot subsist any length of time. They, therefore, who are decrying the Christian religion, whose morality is so sublime and pure, are undermining the solid foundation of morals, the best security for the duration of a free government. Now, you might have noticed through those examples that religion and morals, religion and morality, religion and virtue are always paired together. That's because the founders and 18th century Americans in general believed that without religion, you weren't going to have a chance of promoting morality or virtue. George Washington himself said as much in his farewell address, where he said, quote, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Religion also provided a metaphysics for society because it taught that everyone was made by God in his image, and from that simple teaching came ideas about equality, since everyone is a child of God. Freedom, because everyone is made imago Dei, in the image of God, and therefore we have Logos, the divine spark within us. And from that we got the idea of natural rights, which extends not all the way back to the 17th century and John Locke, but even further back to the later scholastics at the end of the medieval period. And because Christianity taught that man was also a fallen creature, it explained why governments were needed. Man was not an angel, and so some outside controlling force was necessary to keep him on the straight and narrow. And before we finish the video, just wanted to remind you guys really quickly that you can still ask your questions for the 100 subscribers celebratory Q&A. Just go to the announcement video, drop your question in the comment box, and I will see you there. Christianity, of course, wasn't the only element that went into the founding. There was also history. A ton of it, particularly history from the classical world, that, interestingly enough, went directly into the founding of America itself. In his essay, Open Shutters on the Past, E. Christian Kopp reminds us that, for example, the separation of powers that we see in the Constitution came directly from the ancient world, specifically the constitution of the old Roman Republic, which was a mixture of the rule of one, the monarchical principle, which we see today in the presidency, the rule of the few, the aristocratic principle, which we see today in the Senate, and the rule of the many, the democratic principle, which we see in the House of Representatives. The classical tradition even gave us the idea of 2 senators from each state, an idea that was taken from the Amphictyonic Council of ancient Greece. And before anyone thinks that the classical tradition was only felt on the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, one of Dave Rubin's classical liberals, said a few years before his death that the ideas and sentiments of the Declaration of Independence, they weren't supposed to be original. Instead, they were supposed to draw upon and continue the ideas and sentiments of Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, and Locke. 2 modern thinkers, 2 classical thinkers. But the classical tradition did even more than that. It also provided Americans with a vocabulary that they could use. E. Christian Kopp again points out that many of the arguments against tyranny that we see in the Declaration of Independence and in the innumerable revolutionary pamphlets drew upon the classical tradition, because classical writers and thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, and Tacitus, they had defined what tyranny consisted of and had actually given examples of tyranny from their times, ideas and examples that the colonists were then able to draw upon and use for their own purposes. The same was true for the idea of republic. Now today, republican self-government, that's supposed to be the norm. We all think, yeah, that's the only legitimate form of government that there is. But in the 18th century, republic was actually a dirty word. Republics were seen as backwards and unworkable, corrupt. Monarchy was the way to go in the 18th century. Leaning especially upon my man Cicero, who was also a hero of John Adams, FYI, Americans made the case to themselves and to the world that republics were legitimate and that they could work. All of this was helped by 2 other elements. The first one being that Americans, elite and common, were marinated in the classics. If you went to any sort of school at all, you knew Latin and you knew Greek, because your schoolmaster would drill those into your head for 8 to 10 hours every single day. And to practice your translation and reading comprehension skills, guess what? You were given classical Greek and Latin texts to read. And the second thing that helped was the literacy rate in the colonies. Not every American could read and write, granted, But Americans were much more literate than any of their European cousins. To give just one example, there were 4 times as many newspapers being published in the American colonies than there were in France, even though France had 6 times the population as the colonies did, and France was the most educated European country in the 18th century. What this all boils down to is that more Americans, not just the elite, had access to this classical vocabulary and were able to read it and comprehend it. The really cool thing about the historical tradition in 18th century America, gang, is that it could literally become alive for them. Through ideas like the cyclical idea of history, the idea that history is moved through impersonal principles and forces, through the idea of sentimental time, time that was not so much rational as emotional, and time that was cyclical instead of linear, and through the idea of typology, where a person or event in the present was tied to and connected to a person or event in the past. 18th century Americans literally believed that they could become the heroes of the past, and that the past could literally live again. When George Washington was called the American Cincinnatus after the Roman hero, as he was very often called, that wasn't just a nice compliment and that wasn't just hyperbole. On some level, it was meant literally. George Washington, in some way, was Cincinnatus reborn because he embodied the principles and the virtues of the ancient Roman hero. When Alexander Hamilton wrote a series of essays arguing against the Whiskey Rebellion, and he signed the essays Tully, another name for Cicero, he was in a real sense actually becoming Cicero. He was fighting against the forces of chaos that threatened to overwhelm the Republic, just like the actual Cicero had done. And this putting on the historical masks of the past, as the historian Aaron Shalev has called it, was available to everyone. In her letters to Mercy Otis Warren, Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, signed her letters Portia. Now, Portia was the wife of Brutus. He was the Roman who was part of the assassination of Julius Caesar, who was seen as the tyrant who officially killed the Roman Republic. Brutus was therefore held as the great Roman hero who had valiantly attempted to defend liberty against tyranny. Abigail, of course, saw John, her husband, as an 18th century modern-day Brutus, standing up against the tyranny of Britain and George III. And since she was John's wife, she was also Brutus's wife. She was an 18th century Portia. In this way, the virtues, strengths, and deeds of the past lived again in 18th century America, not just intellectually, not just because someone had read a book or a text about them, but actually, through what historian Douglas Adair calls symbolic experience, which not coincidentally encouraged the American patriots to fight all the harder for independence. If you have grown up hearing about the great heroes of the past who defended liberty against tyranny, and then you yourself step into that historical drama, and now you, like them, are defending liberty against tyranny, you are going to fight all that much harder because you do not want to sully your reputation in your name or their name. And a third element of the founding was the Georgic tradition, the idea that nature, it's not an idyllic place. It is a harsh, if beautiful space where people have to sweat, work, toil, and bleed in order to scratch out a livelihood. Now, this idea came from, surprise, surprise, the classical world, especially from the ancient poets Hesiod and Virgil. For the founders, the Georgic tradition, the farmer tilling the soil for his livelihood and for that of his family, was a guarantee of freedom, self-sufficiency, and independence. In his letter, What is an American?, Hector St. John Crèvecoeur described an American as, quote, "We are all tillers of the earth, united by the silken bands of mild government, all respecting the laws without dreading their power, because they are equitable. We are all animated with the spirit of an industry which is unfettered and unrestrained, because each person works for himself." Historian Bruce Thornton says that this idea tied freedom, equality, and industry directly to the land, which explains why founders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wanted the United States to remain an agrarian republic of yeoman farmers. And it even explains why commercialists like Alexander Hamilton, the dread enemy of Jeffersonian agrarianism and philosophy, understood the importance of the agrarian element and did not want to see it completely scrubbed away by large cities and a merchant class. Why? Because without that agrarian yeoman element, America risked becoming what commercial countries like England and France had already become: dissipated, immoral, and slavish. So how does this all tie together? Through what has been dubbed the tradition of liberty, the line of thought that stretched from the ancient world to modern times. A line of thought that says that man is not the center of the universe, contra classical liberalism, but is actually beholden to elements like religion, history, and environment. All of which give a positive idea of what man is and what a just and flourishing society is. Without these elements, without this tradition, liberty dissipates, equality becomes a joke, and people become slaves. The great contrast to this was the French Revolution, which John Adams described thus in 1828. Helvetius and Rousseau preached to the French nation liberty, till they made them the most mechanical slaves, equality till they destroyed all equity, humanity till they became weasels and African panthers, and fraternity till they cut one another's throats like Roman gladiators. A little deeper than Dave Rubin's classical liberalism. But now, as usual, what say you? Is classical liberalism a legit solution to all of the problems and collapse and chaos that we see around us today? Or to counter that, is it going to require something a little bit more deeper, like the tradition of liberty as understood by 18th century Americans? As always, let me know your thoughts, ideas, and opinions in the comment box below. Well, that about wraps up everything for this week, gang. Before you go, if you could give the video a like, share it with your friends on social media, I would be very much obliged. And if you like videos like this that touch on politics, culture, and religion, but from a different POV, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications so that you will always know when I post new videos just like this that you're not going to want to miss. Thanks for giving me a little bit of your day. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed to my channel. I appreciate you and I am grateful to you all. And until next week, gang, remember to dare to read, think, speak, and write. I'll see you next time. Ciao.